Theologians can debate almost anything, like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. But one thing most scholars agree on, in his parables, Jesus talked an awful lot about money. So what lessons should we take from Jesus' teaching in the parables? Today we'll get an economist's point of view. Financial planner and teacher Rob West unpacks the parables with Jerry Bowyer. Then it's your questions, too, at 800-525-7000. Jot that down, 800-525-7000. I'm Steve Moore, and welcome to MoneyWise. Well, Rob, folks don't often use the words interesting and economist in the same sentence, but we sure do whenever Jerry Bowyer joins us.
Well, that's an understatement, Steve. Jerry's one interesting guy. He's also our resident economist here at MoneyWise. He's the chief economist over at Vidant Financial. You can see him quite a bit on the Fox Business Channel. And Jerry, always a pleasure to have you with us, sir. Welcome to MoneyWise.
And it's always a pleasure to be with you. I find you guys interesting, too, so it's mutual.
I wonder what he meant by that.
Let's leave that one there. As we said at the top, most scholars agree that Jesus uses money and possessions frequently throughout the parables, and those lessons are understood for the most part. But, Jerry, you've looked closely at how Jesus uses money, and I'd love for you to expand on that a bit.
Yeah, well, you're right. Scholars have noticed that Jesus talks a lot about money. You and I have both been under the influence of Ron Blue and Larry Burkett and others who 40, 50 years ago were telling us that actually Jesus talks about money a lot. Yeah. So if you think talking about money is unspiritual, then you're going to think Jesus is unspiritual. So, there's been a lot of progress made. So taking that seriously, I thought, as an economist, maybe I should look really closely at what he says about money. Not just that he talks about it a lot, but what does he say? And one of the barriers to that, it's not an insurmountable barrier, is that Jesus lived in a different time, in a different place, with different place names and different economics than us, and he tells these financial parables, and they have numbers in them, but most of us are not trading ephahs of barley with one another, so we don't really have a sense of, these numbers make sense, and, what's the background, and, what are the details of these stories, these little financial short stories that Jesus writes and speaks aloud, what do they tell us? And it turns out that when you actually look at the archaeology and get a sense of, how that economy worked, that Jesus' parables are sophisticated and true to life. In other words, his parables, there's one exception, his parables use numbers that would pass muster in a business school case study at the time. They are true to life, real numbers. They're what you would have seen in, say, an entrepreneurial culture of like Galilee, where you've got a lot of small farmers and you've got a lot of small builders. So Jesus knew his stuff. And we all knew that Jesus knew his stuff because he's the incarnate Word of God.
Right.
But we're now seeing in detailed ways just how much Jesus knew his stuff.
Well, and a real familiarity with business as well. For example, the parable of the unfaithful steward, right?
Yeah, the parable of the unfaithful steward, these numbers ring true. This is what someone with 15 or 40 acre farm, which Jesus grew up around, would have been dealing with in terms of the amounts of money. In other words, he actually described the way the market worked in his time. There used to be this idea that Jesus was kind of a country bumpkin. That he was, some would, not to insult people, from the Appalachian Belt, right, but that he was sort of an Appalachian guy, of his time, insulated and poor, sort of surprised by what he saw in the big city, et cetera. That's the picture. It's not a fair portrayal of people who grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, and it's not a fair portrayal of Jesus. He actually grew up around a lot of financial sophistication. Nazareth wasn't a standalone town. It was an exurb of Sepphoris, which was the banking center of Galilee. So Jesus and Joseph were within morning commute distance of a financially sophisticated town that underwent a building boom during Jesus' teen years and early 20s. So he would have been around this stuff all the time. So he knew bankers, he knew investors, he knew the world of finance. He knew the world of farming too, but he knew the world of finance. He was knowledgeable. He was smart. He's infinite, but he also, in his human nature, was somebody who understood the issues of his day very well.
Yeah. Well, when we come back, we'll talk about Jesus' view of the world as a small business person, a carpenter, whether or not he was anti-business, and even some of the dangers of greed. That's all right around the corner.
Looking at the parables of Christ today on MoneyWise with Rob West and our special guest economist, Jerry Bowyer. Later in the program, taking your calls, 800-525-7000. We'll be right back.
Money and life run on the same track, but unfortunately, sometimes it seems like your money is heading in a different direction from your goals. In Never Enough, 3 Keys to Financial Contentment, author Ron Blue helps you to break down all your financial options to a basic 4, and then shows you how to keep it all chugging along in the right direction on the same track. Never Enough, 3 Keys to Financial Contentment, available when you click the store button at MoneyWise.org.
Would you like your life to be infused with joy? Would you like to interject an eternal dimension into even the most ordinary day? Author Randy Alcorn says you can when you discover the Treasure Principle. In a concise, power-packed style, this newly revised and updated book offers a 6-step plan to finding the immediate pleasure and eternal rewards of the Treasure Principle. And once you discover it, life will never look the same. The Treasure Principle is available when you click the store button at MoneyWise.org.
Welcome back to MoneyWise with Rob West. I'm Steve Moore, and joining us today, economist Jerry Bowyer, who always sheds a lot of interesting light on God's Word and what it has to do with us today in the marketplace. And today we're looking at the parables of Jesus. Rob?
Jerry's a student of economics and God's Word. And yeah, as you said, Steve, a really interesting look at the parables today, perhaps one you've never looked at. And it really is looking through the lens of Jesus' understanding of the times and business and money, being fully man and fully God. And let's start with his work, Jerry. He was obviously a carpenter, a small business person. How did that inform his teaching?
Well, I think it informed his teaching very deeply. And everyone knew he was a carpenter because when he was a teacher, when he started his teaching up in Galilee, they said, "Is this not the carpenter?" And they also said, "Is this not the son of the carpenter?" Yes. And there's something interesting about that, probably not our focus today, which is that, part of what's going on here is he doesn't have a seminary degree, right? He didn't go through the religious theological formation of the time, which was you apprentice to a rabbi for a certain period of time and you get certified. So a lot of the resistance to Jesus is that he's a carpenter, not a rabbi. Carpenters never became rabbis. Sometimes rabbis would become carpenters. They would do some work on the side. Paul became a tent maker. But they would be certified rabbis from wealthy families first, and then they would take on a trade in addition to that. And it's interesting, someone else pointed something out to me recently. Here we see the influence of Joseph. We've talked about the influence of Mary on her son. When we forget, Jesus was a baby. We just had the Christmas season. He had to be raised. And part of his being raised was being influenced by a mother and a father. And the father's influence is shown in the occupation. We don't see Joseph talking a lot. And often the father's influence isn't mainly talking. Often the father's influence is working and apprenticing. So Jesus apprenticed to Joseph, and he learned the business. And I think learned an appreciation for business people and the business activity. Because as I pointed out before, up in Galilee, he has no criticisms of any wealthy people or any business people. All the criticisms about wealth wait until he goes down to Judea and starts confronting religious and political leaders. And I would say that's true for his parables as well.
Yeah, and that really leads us to this next point, is that there has been talk over the years that some of Jesus' teaching was anti-business. Tell us your view on that.
Yeah, in general, the parables, the business owner is the God figure in the parable, which is an odd thing. If you wrote a bunch of stories and in almost all your stories the business person was the good guy, you probably, are not anti-business. But there's a couple of parables, the parable of Lazarus and the rich man and the rich fool, have sometimes been used as a bludgeon against business people. And I think the idea here is that some people have gotten it into their mind that the danger of greed is a danger only for people in business, that people in ministry or people in politics, greed doesn't apply to them. So only people who work with money, only people who work for corporations, or only people who own business, greed is about them. Capitalism is greedy, but socialism isn't. And the fact is, greed is universal. But having done some detailed research on Lazarus and the rich man, which I've got an article coming out about soon, and the rich fool, which I've already written about, careful attention to the details indicate that the main target of both of these parables are actually the religious and political elites. Now, greed is universal, but it's interesting when Jesus tells his stories about how greed is a problem, he tells stories that evoke political and religious leaders. There's a lot of reason to believe that Lazarus versus the rich man, that the rich man is the high priest. Lots of little details of the story. The choice of colors are exactly the thing in the Greek New Testament that are the colors that the high priest wore. The high priest had 5 brothers, and the rich man says, "Go back and warn my 5 brothers." So there's a lot going on there, and there's lots of other details too. Details about the food. When the Lazarus is put on the porch of the rich man, the Greek word there is only used for temples in the New Testament. It's never used for a mansion. So I think kind of the main barb here is the high priest. He certainly thought so because he wanted Jesus killed. And the rich fool, I think we've talked about that a little bit. The only thing that we see in Israel archaeology that looks anything like the granary of the rich fool would be the granaries where the taxes were stored by the nobility. We don't see anything like that used by private farmers. Now, of course, private people, non-religious and non-political leaders, can be greedy, but these parables, their sharpest barbs were at the religious and political leaders. Yes. So I think religious and political leaders should be a little hesitant about turning around and using these only to bludgeon business people.
Yeah, the bottom line here, if we look closely, is that the trappings of wealth are real, and they can affect anyone at every end of the spectrum of prosperity or the lack thereof. The key is it's ultimately about a heart condition, right?
It is ultimately about a heart condition, but I want to get rid of this idea that business people are on the suspect list for having a bad heart condition. Yeah. But the religious and political leaders who are always accusing them are not on the suspect list. You see the confrontations with the gospel, largely the greedy people who end up killing Jesus because he messes with their money aren't like his friend Joseph of Arimathea, the tin merchant. They're the religious and political elite. And the fact that they think that they're not subject to greed makes them all the more subject to greed. If you think you're exempt from greed, then you're more in danger of greed than anybody else.
That's a great wisdom today. Jerry, with just a couple of minutes left, we get the spiritual implications of Jesus' financial teaching in the parables, but give us a bit of a picture, an insight into how his contemporary audiences may have viewed it at the time.
Well, I think there's kind of 2 examples that come to mind. I don't know if we have time to talk about both of them, but one is the parable of the vineyard, which right after Jesus tells the parable of the vineyard in Luke's gospel, that is exactly when the religious and political leaders of Jerusalem say, the gospel says, they discerned that he was talking about them, and they were afraid of the crowds, and that's when they set out to destroy him. So Jesus had messed with people's religion up till then a fair amount. But it's when he messed with their money that they went from angry to plotting murder. And I think that's kind of an insight into human nature for all of us. People, you can mess with our religion, you can mess with our theology, we might have an argument, but when you mess with people's money, that's when the knives come out. And Jesus was murdered by those people. By the way, the gospel doesn't say they're wrong. He really was talking about them. I mean, they understood it. In some sense, they understood these parables better than we modern Christians do, because we think it's just a heart story. It is a heart story, but it's also a social story. It's also about how we treat the poor and how leaders treat other people. So they discerned that he was talking about them, and he was. They were wrong to murder him. They should have repented. That's what John the Baptist said. Be content with your wages. Don't shake people down. Don't commit fraud. John the Baptist talked specifically to that Judean elite. And John knew they wouldn't listen. He said the axe is at the root. And with Jesus, we see that. So they should have repented. Basically, the alternative is repent or murder Jesus. They chose what they thought was the path of least resistance, but actually it wasn't, because within a generation, everything they had was taken away. The rejection of Jesus put the nation on a self-destruct course, which ended up destroying the temple and all of Jerusalem with them.
Yeah, and all ultimately a part of God's plan for redemption. Jerry, always a joy to have you here. Fascinating. We could talk about this for hours. We appreciate you stopping by.
It's always a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you, Jerry. If you'd like to read his articles, you'll find many of them at townhall.com, townhall.com. You're listening to MoneyWise with Rob West, taking your calls after this break, 800-525-7000. Available 24/7. You can call right now or call later. We'll do our best to get you on to an upcoming program. 800-525-7000. This is MoneyWise.
The financial wealth you leave behind could be the best thing that ever happened to your loved ones, or the worst. In Splitting Heirs, Giving Your Money and Things to Your Children Without Ruining Their Lives, Ron Blue explains why it's important to make these decisions now, instead of forcing your heirs to do it later. Splitting Heirs will foster a real appreciation for the precious resources that God has entrusted to you. And it's available when you click the store button at MoneyWise.org.
Do you feel like your hands are tied with debt, preventing you from serving God? If you have credit card debt, Christian credit counselors can help. Through our debt management program, we can get you out of credit card debt about 80% faster while honoring your debt in full. For more information on how Christian credit counselors can help, visit ChristianCreditCounselors.org. That's ChristianCreditCounselors.org. Or call 800-557-1985. 800-557-1985.
Hey, it's great to have you along today on MoneyWise. You're listening to this program courtesy of your favorite radio station. If you enjoy what you hear from them on a daily basis, let them know. Give them a call. I'm sure they'd love to hear from you. And give us a call. We definitely would like to hear from you. This is a call-in program, but if you don't do your part, then we can't do our part, and it just doesn't work. So here's the phone number, 1-800-525-7000. We're taking your financial calls, questions on anything today, 800-525-7000. Now let's begin by going to Kansas City. Hey, Jane, welcome to the program. How can we help you?
Yes. My husband and I are in our late 50s, and we've been looking into getting some long-term care insurance possibly for the last 2 or 3 years. And we have had 2 different plans proposed to us, one coming from our longtime financial planner and the other coming from a long-term care advisor.
Yeah.
They are different types of programs, and we just are wondering, we just don't know what to do. Is one better than the other? I just don't know.
Yeah. Tell me about the various long-term care insurance policies that were proposed from the 2 professionals.
The first one is, I guess, from what I understand, it would be considered more of a traditional long-term care insurance policy.
Right.
It, has a monthly premium.
Yeah.
We are able to have like shared benefits with that.
Yes.
It has an inflation rider with it, a tax benefit, the way I understand it, tax qualified. And my husband and I, we have been through like all the health screening and everything. We both are in a position where we got the preferred status.
Great.
So we have the best discount
Yes.
that you can get with that. And that's kind of one of our reasons that we're trying to get a decision made, because we're like, if we're going to get this, we want to get it while we're still healthy before one of us doesn't qualify or something.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And then the other one is one of what they refer to, as I understand it, as a hybrid policy, where
Yes.
it's actually a whole life insurance policy, but it has long-term care insurance with it.
Right.
You pay the whole amount up front, so you don't ever have to worry about premium increases or anything like that. It has a death benefit. So, yeah.
Yes. And were you able to work through on that hybrid policy what the actual long-term care benefits would be? And did those sync up, Jane, with what you would like to have in the way of coverage for whatever type of care you might need on a daily benefit, as well as things like the inflation riders and those kinds of things? Do you feel like, just based on the benefits specifically related to long-term care, that it would meet your needs as you identified them?
Yes, I think so.
All right. I think that's the key. You know, if we back up for a second here, Jane, I mean, I like long-term care insurance. This is the time to be looking at it between 55 and 65, and I'd prefer on the younger end of that range in terms of when you'd want to go out and look for it. I love the idea that you've got preferred status, which says that you're healthy. You've obviously taken care of your health, and you're going to be rewarded for that in terms of the premium amount. The numbers say that 69% of today's 65-year-olds eventually will need some type of long-term care. About half of those will experience a high need where there's cognitive impairment or the need with these two what are called ADLs, activities of daily living, which are the trigger for long-term care insurance. So it's about a 50-50 situation. Now, the cost is obviously the challenge. I mean, this is probably the number one thing that can erode wealth in that season of life. Everything else we can pretty much plan for, but this is a big unknown, especially with the cost of healthcare these days. You know, the average cost for a private room in a nursing home is about $267 a day. That's about $100,000 a year. An assisted living is about half that, $123 a day, or about $45,000 a year. So you've got to begin to think about how are we going to account for that, and that's where a policy like this comes in. I've looked at some of the hybrid policies. My experience is that I'd rather you just get the right policy for you with traditional long-term care insurance in terms of making sure it has the right benefit, that it has the inflation riders, that it has all of the elements. You know, look at the waiting period to make sure that it's the right thing that fits into your budget so you can stay with it for the long haul. You don't end up dropping it and therefore you lose out on all the money you've paid in because it's no longer available. Not a cash value, but meaning if the policy is no longer in force, then it's of no benefit to you, versus trying to go with the hybrid policy. Now, the hybrid is certainly an option, and as long as it meets your need, I like that it's providing a dual benefit. My experience has just been that in terms of looking at these policies, I would opt for making sure the price point is right for your budget and making sure you get the right benefits over trying to marry it up with a whole life policy. I would put that second to getting the right policy for you that's going to provide the coverage you need.
Jane, thank you for your call. We appreciate that very much. 800-525-7000 if you'd like to speak with Rob West today. Another way to speak with Rob is to send us an email. Keep it brief, like this one from Terry, who says, "Dear Rob, I just transferred a balance on an existing credit card to take advantage of 0% interest for 21 months. I know that having a new card will affect my credit score of 781. I don't plan to use the old card again. How long should I wait until I close it?"
Yeah, I'm not terribly concerned about you closing that card, Terry. Congrats on your 781. Obviously, you've managed your financial life well. The amounts owed is that portion of your score, which is about 30%, is the first place we see a negative impact. What happens is the overall credit utilization goes up as that particular credit card's credit is no longer available to you. So as the credit available drops, if you have balances, the credit utilization is higher. And if that goes over 25%, you could use or see a drop in your score. If you don't have any debt that you're carrying, that's not a factor. The second issue is what's called the length of credit history. This is 15% of your FICO score. Good news is in the case of FICO, which is the most widely used, closing the account doesn't affect you until the account rolls off your report, which is going to be 10 years from now. Now, the Vantage score algorithm, which is the other one, it's growing in popularity. It's not as big as FICO. That one does not factor closed accounts into the length of credit history as soon as it's closed. So that could reduce your score because now you have this account with a long history that's no longer available. Bottom line, I'm not as concerned about your credit score as I am you getting rid of an account that you're not using because of the opportunity for fraud and so forth. So I'd go ahead and close it. I wouldn't look back. If there's any impact, it's going to be very minimal.
And if you'd like to send a brief email to Rob, here's the address: questions@moneywise.org. questions@moneywise.org. Well, as you think about your money, what are your hopes? Would you like to understand and manage it better? Would you like to know whether you need to make more or just be more creative with what you have? Ron Blue's book, Simplifying the Money Conversation, is a great primer on how to give and be generous and manage your money according to God's financial principles. Now, this 24-page resource is available to you when you visit MoneyWise.org. That's MoneyWise.org. Thanks for listening. Have a great remainder of your day, and then join us again next time.